These were the sounds that reverberated throughout the town of Neath in 1988. The area around the castle is undergoing a significant transformation, ready for its entry into the 21st century. That large-scale redevelopment has resulted in the complete obliteration of the old medieval layout of the town. Rising from that temporary chaos, Safeway's supermarket symbolizes the emergence of the affluent society. But the castle and nearby St. Thomas's Church have survived, enduring monuments of the typical Middle Ages town plan of a castle-church nucleus. This crumbled ruin, now merely a passive ornamental embellishment to a new way of life, once was a manifestation of autocratic power and witness to scenes of terror and destruction. The character and purpose of the castle has fluctuated with the passage of time. For St. Thomas's Church, although the fabric of the building has undergone change, its main purpose as a spiritual stronghold of the Christian faith has survived and endured down the centuries. Neath is situated at what was in earlier times the lowest crossing point of the River Neath. Here was the junction of a Roman highway system. Of this system, the Roman camp at Braincombach, situated on Morva Mountain above Tonner, the largest Roman marching camp in Wales, predates Needham Fort at Neath. Needham was sited strategically at the junction of two important Roman highways, the Via Julia Maritima, which followed the coastal fringe from Cardiff, and the Sarn Helen, which ran up the Neath Valley along the ridge of Hir Vannes to Argyre at Brecon, via the auxiliary forts at Colburn. From Neath, the road ran westwards to the Roman camp at Lacher. Following the erection of a wooden fortification, a stone fort was built circa 120 AD on the site of the playing fields at Dŵr on the west bank of the River Neath. It is on record that a Roman fort existed somewhere in the Neath area, but its exact location was not discovered until excavations for the housing estate at Roman Way revealed the footings of the southeast gateway, which overlooked the river. Here, the legionaries kept a constant vigil against that hostile and troublesome Welsh tribe, the Silures. The Romans left Britain about 420 AD, and in the ensuing years, little is known of any human settlement in the area until the arrival of the Normans. When Robert Fitzhamon conquered Glamorgan in 1093, a Norman knight, Sir Richard de Granville, who was granted lands in the Neath area, first established a primitive Motte and Bailey type castle on the west bank of the river, somewhere near Needham. However, as a result of sustained Welsh opposition, he built another castle on the more easily defended east bank, where the present ruins now stand. Later, a D-shaped mound protected by a wooden palisade, believed to have been built by the Lord of Glamorgan, Earl Robert of Gloucester, was constructed on the site. That fortification was superseded by a stone structure which was built on the foundations of the earlier castle. The Normans were systematic in their subjugation of a territory, first building a fortification, then setting up an administrative structure. This was known as a bastide, which laid down laws and directives providing inducements to encourage people to settle around the castle. Charters were granted giving certain rights and privileges, such as specific grants of lands and the right to trade free of tolls and taxes, which gave rise to a predominant class of people called the burgesses, and eventually led to the formation of boroughs and borough councils. The first known Neath Charter was granted by the Earl of Gloucester in 1150. So, the town grew and developed around a typical medieval layout of a castle and church nucleus. St. Thomas's Church became the garrison church, but it is not known when the first church was built or where it was actually sited. But it is recorded that a chaplain was assigned to the garrison in 1262. Over the next few centuries, the hostile Welsh rose up continually in rebellion against the Norman conquerors. There were raids in 1167 and 1184. In 1231, following the death of Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester and Lord of Glamorgan, the castle was attacked by the forces of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, Llywelyn the Great. The earth and timber fortification was taken, razed to the ground, the garrison slaughtered, and the town burned. In 1259, the town was burned, but the castle held out. In 1314, following the death of the young Gilbert de Clare, the last of the de Clare line at the Battle of Bannockburn, a further series of Welsh uprisings took place. In 1322, the avaricious Hugh Despenser, having succeeded to the de Clare estates, was attacked by the other barons. Neath Castle was destroyed by the Earl of Hereford, and it is thought that the present ruined castle was built after that period. In 1402, during the Owain Glyndŵr insurrection, there were 100 lancers and 30 archers garrisoned here. Having trod the stage of Glamorgan history, the Norman martial lords, like the Romans before them, made their exit. Now established as a market town, Neath slowly evolved through Elizabethan and Georgian times. The Norman castle, which was in a ruinous condition sometime in the 15th century, is now a mere symbol of its past greatness, but still seems to dominate the satellite timber dwellings of the small but burgeoning township. The medieval route through the town ran from the river bridge along what was called Old Street to the castle, turning into High Street, later to be renamed Old Market Street, with its market cross and Guild Hall, then along what we know today as Water Street. A plan of Neath circa 1550 shows that a second street was built alongside Old Street to become known as New Street. Documentary evidence indicates that both these streets were in existence before 1298. These were subsequently renamed Duck Street and Cattle Street. This map also shows the position of the Great House, residence of the notable Evans family, which was situated at Neath Square. The researches and publications of Mr. Glenn A. Taylor, a distinguished local historian in the early part of this century, enable us to conjure up a fascinating picture of the development of Neath Town. A street plan of 1800 shows that the medieval layout of Castle Church nucleus is still intact. But now, the main thoroughfare through the town is along Cattle Street, the former New Street, past the castle to Old Market Street, across Navy Square to Water Street, then along the Mirror, and from there down Eastland Road. In those turnpike days, the Ship and Castle Inn, now the Castle and Hotel, was the point of arrival and departure for the Royal Mail coach. Today, historic Old Market Street has fallen into relative obscurity, its ancient preeminence having been usurped by a more direct route through the town via New Street and Orchard Street. Originally, Old Market Street was 60 feet wide to accommodate the ancient Guild Hall, a building on stilts which may have looked something like this. The ground floor was probably a marketplace. It was sited in the centre of the road between the Duke of Wellington Inn and the St. Ives Inn. Following the demolition of the old Guild Hall in 1821 in favour of the town hall we know today, the buildings on the west side of the street were later extended, as shown in red in this sketch by Glenn Taylor. So, the ancient part of these buildings, for example, the St. Ives Inn, lies on the Church Place side. Its name reflects the mutual trade of South Wales coal and Cornish copper ore that flourished in those days. The present frontage in Old Market Street is therefore a development from about the end of the 19th century. A commemorative plaque on the front of the St. Ives Inn records that in the vicinity of the castle there once stood the Guild Hall, the House of Lords Inn, Samuel Buildings and the synagogue. It is also the site of the trade fairs that took place from 1280 to 1865. Further up the street, the modern front of the TSB building conceals a much older fabric that was known as the Red House. Sometime residence of James Fear Davis, cabinet maker and undertaker. Next to the TSB, Adrian Hicks the butcher occupies what was originally the House of Lords Inn, formerly known as the Bunch of Grapes. This photograph was taken about 1890. The early street names were indicative of the general activities of the town. Names such as Duck Street, Cattle Street, Cow Lane and the Bull Ring recall the various trade fairs that took place several times of the year. This is Duck Street before its demolition in 1967. Cow Lane, where iron staples were set into the walls to tether animals, afforded minor access into Old Market Street from the top end of Cattle Street. In those far-off days before the motor car chugged its way into history, cattle fairs, horse fairs, woolen and flannel fairs were held in the streets. And of course there was, and still is, the Great September Fair, an annual event that really drew the crowds. It was Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester and Lord of Glamorgan, who granted a charter in 1280 to hold a fair on the church feast day of St. Margaret. The Fair of St. Margaret is one of the oldest in Britain, older even than the famous Nottingham Goose Fair. For centuries then, this traditional fair flourished, held in the area near the castle. It was based on a system of barter, each trader paying a levy to the Earl for setting up a stall on the site. But by the middle of the 19th century, the fair slowly changed in character from a trade fair to that of entertainment. The change started in Old Market Street, where wooden roundabouts appeared, providing rides on wooden horses. From that modest beginning sprang the noisy, colourful extravaganza that was to delight so many over the years. The site of the modern fair has been changed a number of times as the town developed. In 1856, the fair took place on the Corporation Field in the Mirror, where it remained for 40 years. In 1896, when the Victoria Gardens was built on the site, the fair was moved to the Bird in Hand Field, where it was held for 60 years. Then, when they built the Civic Centre there, the fair went back to its original site across the canal onto what was, at that time, the town rubbish tip near the castle. In 1822, with a steady expansion of the town, the old Guild Hall was replaced by the present Town Hall, an elegant structure built on the junction of Church Place, Kettle Street and New Street. The town stocks were sited here in the corner of the churchyard and were in use up to the middle of the last century. As the town expanded, road communications changed accordingly. The early primitive roads were improved and toll gates erected to recover the costs. In 1823, there were 6 toll gates placed at the entrances to the town. This one was at the corner of Kimler Road and Eastland Road, on the site of the present-day Drill Hall. The last tolls were collected here in 1884, and the house was demolished in 1912. Another, the West Gate, was sited at Caddixon Road, near the entry to the old river bridge. The White Cottage was the toll house where lived a Mr. James Fear, later to become vestry clerk of Neath. The large house next to it was replaced by this building, which still exists, and was formerly the De Never Estate Office. This toll gate ceased to operate in 1889 and was demolished in 1895. Today, plodding cart horse and dirt road have given way to frantic modern road transport. An important feature of Neath's communications is the road bridge spanning the River Neath. John Leland, in his travels in 1536 to 1539, wrote, "There cometh up shiplets almost into the town of Neath from the Severn. Boats come to the very bridge of timber that is somewhat lower on the water than the town. Glenn Taylor has written an account of the development of the bridges over the River Neath. In the 1790s, the existing crossing was reported to be in a ruinous condition. A new masonry bridge was started in 1792 and completed in 1801. Seen here in Thomas Horner's painting of the town in 1819. Its dimensions, which are recorded in the minutes of a meeting in June 1793, were to be 165 feet long, of 3 arches, the centre a 60 feet span, and the 2 side arches 40 feet, the pillars 10 feet, while the width was to be 21 feet over, including the parapets. In 1850, when the Neath and Brecon station was built, the bridge, which was humpbacked, was altered and levelled. In 1869, the structure was widened by adding outrigger pavements. In 1975, following the opening of a new road system at Stockham's Corner, this historic thoroughfare was relegated to become merely a pedestrian link with the town. As the town prospered, Neath became a busy shipping place, and for the townspeople, the sight of a tall-masted ship at Neath Quay was a familiar one. The coming of the railway added a new dimension to communications, and in 1850, a Brunel-designed timber bridge carried rail traffic across the river. In the background can be seen the Vale of Neath Railway. As the railways flourished, the timber supports were replaced by substantial steel and masonry supports. Further development and expansion resulted in the building of a modern, all-steel structure. With the opening of the new road bridge in 1988, Neath now has 3 separate river crossings: road, rail, and pedestrian. With Neath developing into a major market town, there followed a series of industrial enterprises which were to turn Neath into an industrial entity well before the Industrial Revolution proper. Neath is situated approximately in the centre of the Great Basin of the South Wales coalfield. This mineral wealth has been exploited for centuries. The monks of Neath Abbey were mining coal in the Neath area in the 12th century. In 1620, the Evans family of the Great House, which was situated near Neath Square, mined coal on a minor basis to supplement the income from their Knoll estate. But it was that dynamic entrepreneur, Sir Humphrey Mackworth, Squire of the Knoll, who really put Neath on the industrial map. Around 1695, he carried out a major reorganization of the town pits, improving them by installing ventilation, constructing a system of tramways to the town quay, and damming streams to create ponds to drive the various water wheels that powered the machinery. His other great venture was copper, producing copper, lead and silver at his Mellingfutton works, so making Neath the foremost industrial town in Wales at that time. But for the townspeople there was a price to pay. In those early days it could take as many as 22 tons of coal to smelt 1 ton of copper. The roasting process gave off sulfuric acid and arsenic, which was to cast a ghastly mantle of smoke, fumes and grime over the town and its inhabitants. Bad housing and appalling insanitary conditions brought about major outbreaks of cholera and other diseases in 1832, 1849, 1853 and 1866. Matthew Whittington, the prominent Neath printer and postmaster, was one of the victims in 1849. But gradually, national and municipal legislation achieved a steady improvement in conditions. The Knoll Brook, which ran down Water Street through the Lath to the mill pond near the castle and constituted a foul open sewer, was covered over and partly diverted. This is how the site of the present Victoria Gardens looked some time before 1897. This was the area known as the Merra. On the left is the last Knoll pit together with its smithy. Today, the gardens, with their backdrop of Victorian houses, provide a sequestered area within the bustle of a modern town, and a venue for ceremonial and commemorative occasions.
Yn arch dderwydd Cymru, didon ni etholi'r ei olynu. Penchi, i'r arch dderwydd John Williams.
We have seen then a little cavalcade of the recorded history of Neath. First, the arrival of the Romans, the establishing of a planted town by the Normans, its gradual evolution from feudal medieval village to a prosperous market town and industrial town. Our town has a rich and varied history of which the inhabitants can be proud. But all things are transient. Each way of life and each enterprise carries the seeds of its own decay. So, the final half of the 20th century was to see the medieval layout of the town changed beyond recognition. Part 1 dealt with the history and development of the town following the establishing of defensive positions by both the Romans and the Normans in the Neath area. The first thoroughfare through the town was along Old Street, to be followed by a second street named New Street. References to these early streets goes back to 1298. Later, these ancient streets were renamed Duck Street and Cattle Street. reflecting the animal fairs that took place in this burgeoning market town. So the thoroughfare through the town was along Duck Street, past the castle to High Street, which is the present-day Old Market Street. The advent of the 20th century saw a rapid expansion of the borough, resulting in green fields and open spaces being devoured by new development. Minor sporadic changes continued to remodel the face of the town, but by the second half of the century, the narrow, claustrophobic streets with their many substandard and derelict buildings were ripe for major redevelopment in a crowded industrial society. The juggernaut of change was on the move. The ancient route of Duck Street, along which Norman knights and their medieval followers had made their way to and from the castle over the centuries, was about to yield to the tyranny of the motor vehicle. Here, the clip-clop of horses' hooves and the anvil music of the blacksmith was to be heard no more. This block of buildings in Duck Street and Cattle Street was demolished in 1967. Crown Buildings on our left, formerly the Crown Hotel, which stood opposite the Town Hall, was among those destroyed at that time. When demolished, it can be seen that the alignment of Duck Street leads directly to the castle gateway. The White Hart, which stood at the top end of the street, and whose last licensee was a Mr. Ron Jones, closed in May 1986, but was not demolished until 2 years later, to stand in defiant isolation amidst the dereliction that prevailed. Here is the scene after demolition. Cattle Street has survived and retained its identity, but is widened to facilitate motor vehicle access to Old Market Street. But for ancient historic Duck Street and for its inhabitants, it was oblivion. Here is Cattle Street today as a result of the 1988 large-scale redevelopment. The motor car has been banished in favor of a pedestrian precinct. The historic town hall, built in 1820 and sited between Cattle Street and Church Place, is a Grade II listed building, so was not included in the redevelopment, but the other buildings vanished, to be replaced by a block of cosy flats in the 1980s. The Mechanics Institution in Church Place was also conserved and refurbished to exist in harmony with its new neighbours. Built in 1847, this ancient building, like the town hall, has been altered and adapted for various uses in its lifetime. It was designed by Alfred Russel Wallace, the great Victorian scientist, and one of Neath's most famous short-term residents, who, as a young man, taught mathematics and geometry to working-class adult students here. Among his many achievements, he is famed for his collaboration with Charles Darwin on the theory of the evolution of species by natural selection. In 1898, it became a public library. In 1903, the building was damaged by fire, After extensive renovation in 1985, it housed the town museum, which was subsequently removed to the Gwyn Hall in 1995. This passageway, leading from Church Square into Old Market Street, is the site of Cow Lane, which a plaque here tells us was part of the historic area where animal fairs were held in the streets. The other buildings destined for oblivion were those that once existed within the area now occupied by Safeway Superstore and car park. This comprised Glamorgan Street, Russell Street and James Street. Here is Glamorgan Street, with Duck Street and the White Hart on the left. Further down was the start of Russell Street. These two streets were built on the line of the earlier White Hart Lane. The bottom end of Russell Street, where this Coronation Street party took place in 1936, connected to the east end of James Street. Some of the substandard 19th century housing conditions that existed within the Neath borough were carried over into the 20th century. James Street was a typical example. This is the approximate line of James Street, which was situated within the area now occupied by Safeway's car park. On the left-hand side, looking eastwards from Angel Street, were two rows of back-to-back houses. The houses behind were courts, comprising Jolly Court, Thomas Court, and Morgan Court. Court houses were one-up and one-down dwellings. There was no staircase. Access to the upper floor was by means of a ladder and a hole cut into the ceiling. The roof space had no window. Due to the proximity of the River Neath, the area was prone to flooding, so the earthen floors of the houses were raised a foot or two above ground level. Entry into each house was by a single door, which closed against the stone steps. Outside, the drinking water facilities consisted of a few taps shared between the houses. There was a limited number of communal privies, which were not individually flushed. Flushing was achieved by a system which flushed all the toilets at the same time. It is said that it was quite an experience to be sitting on the toilet when it suddenly flushed. Following the demolition of these houses in 1934, the area seems to have been occupied mainly by commercial premises. In this viewpoint taken from the Neath Canal, all these buildings in James Street have succumbed in the making of Safeway's car park. Looking eastwards from Angel Street, on the left-hand side was Western Fruit's warehouse. Next to it was the National Tire Service garage. Also here was Woodfield House, business premises of accountants Watkins and Bradfield, who now have premises adjacent to Safeway's car park. Further along, new houses replaced some of the earlier stone cottages and were sometime occupied by the families of Jones, Harris, Brooks, Roper and Wright. These too were to suffer the same fate and were demolished in the 1988 redevelopment. This was the site of Neath's first gasworks. The Neath Gas Light and Coke Company was established here in 1833, granting the famous Neath Abbey Iron Company the contract to manufacture and erect the equipment. The site was chosen because of its proximity to the Neath Canal, which afforded an efficient means of transportation. At the extreme end of James Street, where it joined Russell Street, in 1932 a part of the old gasworks site was taken over by the renowned Neath and Cardiff Luxury Coach Company. A legend in their lifetime for elegance, speed and punctuality, they were affectionately known as the Brown Bombers. From here, crossing over to the right-hand side of the road, was first Carmel Apostolic Chapel, built in 1879 and demolished in 1988 to make way for the new development, when new premises were built at the newly developed Bridge Street. Its next-door neighbour was Bethlehem Green Baptist Chapel. Here, dedicated men served the spiritual needs of the community. As always, the ladies too made a significant contribution to that purpose. The first chapel was built in 1810. It was rebuilt in 1828 and demolished in September 1979. Further along from these centres of spiritual strength was their rough neighbour, the Borough Jail, which housed those who were not on the side of righteousness and moral rectitude. Built in 1844, it became disused in 1872 and was demolished in 1940 when air raid shelters were built on the site. So, following the issue of compulsory purchase orders by the Borough Council, all the buildings on this medieval site were swept away, and with them went its social history, the people being dispersed and housed in new housing sites within the borough. For a few years, the denuded area merely served as a temporary car park, whilst plans for a major redevelopment of the site were being formulated. In another part of the ancient route through the town, the junction of Old Market Street, Wine Street and Water Street was known as Navis Square. Between 1975 and 1980, historic Water Street experienced a large-scale redevelopment that was significantly to change its character. Today, a plaque on Tesco's wall commemorates the buildings that once occupied the site. This entire block fronting Water Street and Wine Street has been swallowed up by the building of a superstore and a multi-story car park. Included in this block were the Shakespeare Inn, which stood on the corner of Wine Street and Water Street, with its frontage in Wine Street. Next to it, on the east side of Water Street, was the George and Dragon. The Ancient Britain in Wine Street, a very old hostelry, which was in business in the 1830s, and given this ornate facelift in modern times. Another of the well-known pubs in Wine Street was the Bird in Hand, which closed in 1975. These are just a few of the many public houses that have disappeared over the years. In 1894 there were 82 licensed houses listed in the borough, most brewing their own beer on the premises. This is not a reflection on the drunken habits of the populace. Beer was the staple drink. To drink from the local sources of water was to invite trouble. However, drunkenness, it seems, was widespread. But those recalcitrants who had no wish to wrestle with their demons encountered stern opposition from the chapels and other organizations, and the battle was fought from the pulpits and in the streets. In 1903, Gladys Snow was one of the many who helped to fight the Great Fight. The other large-scale redevelopment which took place on the west side of Water Street during the period of 1975 and 1980 was Boots' store, which stands on the corner of Wine Street and Water Street, its frontage, like the Shakespeare's, being in Wine Street. On this corner once stood Allen's, the high-class grocery store, in its day one of the most prestigious shops in Neath, enjoying the patronage of the well-to-do residents of the Neath area. In 1890, Richard Allen, a master grocer, purchased the premises and established a high-class grocery store here, which opened in November 1891. The place was beautifully appointed. Here in those leisurely days, customers were provided with comfortable seating whilst their orders were being attended to, resulting in small social gatherings, which might well have become a regular part of the shopping ethos. In the mid-1800s, this was the site of the vicarage, residence of the highly respected the Reverend H. Knight, who was for 32 years the rector of Neath and Lentwit, a much esteemed scholar and antiquary who died in 1857. Then for Mrs. Allen and family came the end of an era, and here the place stands, boarded up and forlorn, waiting for obliteration, to be superseded by a 20th century lifestyle they could never have imagined. Next door to Allen's, the Narrow Gauge Inn offered a high standard of service, another of the Water Street licensed houses that was consumed by Boots' store. Swallowed up, too, were the premises of Charles Stacey and Sons, well-known Neath printers of No. 6 Water Street. Pictured here with his sons and niece, a photograph taken in 1880. Charles Stacey, born in Bristol in 1827, came to Neath in 1850 and started his printing business here in 1873 and died in 1901. After his death, his sons carried on the family business. But the Greyhound Tavern still survives, having barely escaped the clutches of the Boots redevelopment. Further up the street on the same side, a plaque set into the wall commemorates the site of an almshouse provided by one John Gibbs, Esquire, for 4 poor women of Neath to inhabit, A.D. 1670. Here then is Water Street before its demolition in 1975. The top end of the street, looking to the knoll, is now the site of the Magistrates' Court. This entire block in the lower end of the street is now occupied by the Tesco development. On the west side of the street, all the buildings seen here were engulfed by Boots Superstore. And here is the Water Street of today, neat and tidy, now giving no hint of a time when the town brook once ran through here to supply the mill pond near the castle, a foul open sewer which made its contribution to the severe outbreaks of cholera and other diseases that devastated the Neath community in the mid-1800s. Another forgotten section of the medieval thoroughfare through the town is Bridge Street and its associated river crossing. Egbert Moxham's map of 1852 identifies present-day Bridge Street and Angel Street as James Street, and modern James Street as the Let. It was here, somewhere near the southeast gateway of Needham Fort, situated at the housing estate at Glenlyrus, that the Romans established the river crossing. This served to link their road system on the west bank of the River Neath with the Via Julia Maritima, the coastal road from Cardiff on the east bank of the river. Bridge Street starts at the junction of James Street and Angel Street. Travelling west towards the river, on the right where it joins James Street was a cluster of 3 buildings. On the left, the Neath Athletic Rugby Club premises, formerly the Miners' Arms Public House. In the centre, J. Thomas's grocer's shop, and on the right, Taylor's decorative tile shop. Passing under the railway bridge and over the canal bridge, the other buildings on the right-hand side were the Neath and Brecon Public House. Next door was Wern's the news agents. Further along was the Railway Inn. On the other side of the road, the white building was the site of the Britannia Inn, and also the Minster Pickles Factory, owned by Lloyd Davis, a former mayor of Neath. The property was demolished in 1974. Then, at the river bridge, the towering presence of the old leather house delivers a bold statement. It was built about 1840 by master craftsman James Betts for the prominent Neath Quaker Isaac Redwood to process leather for the making of leather goods. Then, in 1957, the Great White House, festooned in scaffolding, vanished. Later, Ron Gillard's central garage was built on the site. In those early days, Neath was a thriving shipping place, but trade gradually declined due to silting problems, which eventually precluded the larger vessels that were being built in the early part of the 20th century. This substantial building at Grandfields Wharf is testimony to the busy scenes that were once played out here. Little is known of the history of the crossings that spanned the River Neath here, but references to earlier bridges indicate that they were part stone and part trestle construction, until 1801, when a stone structure was built which has survived to the present day. With road traffic building up steadily in the latter half of the 20th century, a new bypass road at Stockham's Corner in 1975 brought about the closure of this historic crossing. Today, it serves as an insignificant pedestrian link between the town and the west bank of the river. From about 1975 onwards, most of the buildings in Bridge Street were demolished. New buildings emerged, custom built by the Borough Council and leased to those organisations who had been issued with compulsory purchase orders on their premises in James Street. Western Fruit's new depot was built on the old Minster Pickle Factory site at Key Road in 1988. Following their closure in 1996, the building was taken over by Zoa Pet Stores. Neath Athletic Rugby Football Club have acquired new impressive premises to become neighbours to the 19th century brickyard cottages. Carmel Apostolic Church at James Street is now the Apostolic Church at Bridge Street. Then, over a period of years, new buildings gradually replaced the old, and only the rugby, grocer and tile trio remained. Then, one day in 1988, they too became victims of the relentless juggernaut of change. The old Vale of Neath Railway is long gone, but one of its bridge abutments has survived. So, Bridge Street, like Old Market Street, has been consigned to obscurity. Today, few can know of the significant part it once played in the history of the town. Across the way in the Upper Latt area, the onrushing juggernaut was in full prime. Here, important pages of Neath's history were not just being turned, but ripped out. The cacophony of sound from the pile drivers seems to sound out the death knell of the town's origins. The castle, which had witnessed so much violence and devastation, was once again the scene of mayhem. But the devastation of long ago was negative and destructive. This temporary chaos is positive and constructive. Close to the castle north wall was a block of stone houses known as the Let, which, it is believed, were added to the medieval area in the early 17th century. Like Jolly Court and Thomas Court in James Street, these also were one up and one down back-to-back houses, which were demolished in the 1950s. The large building on the right is the Quakers' Meeting House, which, being a listed building, has been refurbished by the former Neath Borough Council. Here, the gravestones, which originally were laid flat on the graves in the centre of the little cemetery, have now been placed against the walls. The small, plain, uniform stones bear the names of Neath's Quaker community, an illustrious group of people who made such a significant contribution to the prosperity of the Neath area, in industry and, above all, in social reform. The Quaker national contribution to this cause stands out like a shining beacon within a grossly materialistic Victorian society. Among the names here is Joseph Tregellis Price, an idealistic and vigorous moral campaigner of international fame. Founder of the Peace Society, the forerunner of the League of Nations, a tireless campaigner for peace, the abolition of the slave trade, and capital punishment, he devoted a lifetime to these causes and died in 1854, aged 71. The Quakers were known for their non-acceptance of authority, even refusing to make obeisance to royalty, believing that all mankind held equal station in life. Today, the men and women who embrace this strange and unusual manifestation of the Christian faith now lie unheeded and largely forgotten. Perhaps, in accordance with the tenets embodied in their way of life, this is what they would have wished. Between Wine Street and Knoll Park Road, early maps show an open, undeveloped field. This field on the fringe of the medieval area, which became known as the Bird-in-Hand field, was to carve a niche for itself in the town's history. This was the playing field of Neath Rugby Club, who used the changing rooms and baths behind the Bird-in-Hand Hotel from 1888 to 1897. The Bird-in-Hand, whose last licensee was a Mr. Ben Clark, closed in February 1975. In 1897, the Neath Rugby Club relinquished their playing field to make way for the Bird-in-Hand field to become the new venue for the Neath Fair, which had to vacate the corporation field in the Mirror for the making of Victoria Gardens. In addition to the fair, the Bird-in-Hand field was to become the focal point for a variety of other events. Bertram Mills Circus brought glamour, colour and excitement as horses, tigers and elephants strutted their stuff. At the end of a hectic week's entertainment, there was a dash to catch the train at Neath Station. The field was also the gathering point for the Whitsun marches through the town. Huge crowds of people, dressed in their Sunday best, turned out to take part in this important annual event in the calendar of the local chapels. But it is the great September fair for which the field is best remembered today. During Fair Week, tidal waves of humanity poured into Neath to immerse themselves in this famous and ancient annual event. It was Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester and Lord of Glamorgan, who granted a charter in 1280 to hold a fair on the church feast day of St. Margaret, making it one of the oldest fairs in Britain.
And ladies, not even £20. The dinner, the buffet, and your tea service are once again. Note down the source of its design with the
In the first half of the 20th century, the beating heart of this frenetic assemblage was the mighty, pulsating steam traction engine, which generated the electricity to drive this colourful extravaganza. Central also to the entertainment were the mechanical fairground organs, which were sited in the centre of huge roundabouts, sadly now only a memory, perpetuated by lovingly restored instruments and beautifully crafted working models. The original medieval fairs were animal and trade fairs. Entertainment in Neath, it is said, started in Old Market Street in the early 1800s, where primitive roundabouts and wooden horses were driven round by boys. Later, when roundabouts became larger, they were worked with horses. There were, of course, all manner of sideshows to beguile the multitude. Taylor's boxing booth was also a familiar part of the scene. However, it seems that most of the fighting took place among the rowdy, drunken fraternity, away from these palaces of the noble art. In 1962, this one-time hayfield, which had become a nodal point for numerous functions of the town, passed into oblivion when the concrete bunker-like civic centre reached up to become etched into the sky. Here in the modern, elegant council chamber, its members carried out administrative and civic proceedings. It was here in April 1996 that the Neath Borough Council ceased to exist, handing over powers to the new Neath Port Talbot County Borough. In April 1993, outside the Civic Centre on Prince's Way, which had scythed its way through the Fairfield, the Royal Regiment of Wales proudly accepted the freedom of the borough. Today, it is difficult to appreciate that Neath's Norman origins once existed within the bounds of Safeway's car park. Here lies the foundations of the town's history, which in 1988 had yielded to the tyranny of the affluent society and the motor car. By the 1980s, this cluster of dwellings, now substandard and derelict, had been demolished. Perhaps the close-knit community who lived, worshipped and worked here might have had few regrets when rehoused in other areas of the expanding town. But Duck Street and Cattle Street should not be lost to the memory. They should be remembered as being the alignment of the ancient thoroughfare to the castle and its early satellite township, along which has passed a steady cavalcade of the town's history down the centuries. The turmoil and devastation of those feudal times slowly receded, but even in the early 1400s, the reinforced garrison of the castle gazed out fearfully from the ramparts as Owain Glyndŵr and the Welsh longbowmen rampaged through South Wales. Today, an assemblage of modern houses clusters around the castle ruins, bisected by the once busy industrial Neath Canal, which provides a new amenity to the scene of peacefulness, comfort and prosperity. Only the castle and church remains to remind us of those turbulent times. The ruins now merely symbolic. The church, practical and functional, still calls the faithful to prayer. The town has undergone great changes in its long and varied history. The relentless juggernaut of change is about to enter the electronic age of a new millennium, to bring about further changes, the like of which we cannot possibly imagine. To those who will inherit the 21st century, we proclaim that this is Neath Town. This is how it once was.